Alright guys, we need to talk about Mary Tudor. No, not that Mary Tudor, this Mary Tudor, the younger sister of King Henry VIII. Since she was a child, Mary was always regarded as beautiful, with dark hair and light grey eyes, though she was a bit of a sickly child. She's a whole 5 years younger than King Henry VIII, and that made her only 6 years old when their mother died. She grew up in the English royal court and often played the traditional role of entertaining foreign guests and dignitaries when they came to visit the English court, which is what she was doing when Juana and Philip of Castile came to visit. They were so impressed with the time they spent with the young girl that they had arranged with her father to betroth her to their oldest son, Charles, the future Holy Roman Emperor. Which is cool, but before any of that can play out, her father dies, and her ugly idiot brother becomes king, and he really fucks up her plans. Because like we talked about in the last video, he comes into power and immediately decides to go to war with the French. And after King Henry VIII kind of tires himself out battling the Scottish and the French, he decides that he's going to use his little sister Mary as a pawn and betroth his 18-year-old sister to the 52-year-old King Louis XII of France. And Mary's like, bitch, ew. And she begs her older brother to call this engagement off, but he just straight up refuses. Instead, promising her that when her medieval geriatric husband dies, she can remarry and choose her husband. And she's a beautiful girl who's grown up in the English court, so she has her eye on a few suitors should that come to fruition. So with that, she packs her shit and prepares to go to France. And accompanying her to France are 4 English-speaking maids of honor, including sisters Mary and Anne Boleyn. And when she gets to France, her new husband is weird as fuck. He described her as a nymph from heaven and was desperate to make an heir to his throne with her, since he had none from his last 2 marriages. But in an act that can only be from the Lord herself, Louis dies within 3 months of their wedding. And Mary was kept in isolation away from men in France for a few months just to make sure she wasn't pregnant with an heir. And once it was determined that she was not carrying the future king of France, her brother Henry immediately started making plans to try to marry her off again, to some other old-ass man in a peace treaty. But Mary had absolutely zero intention of doing her brother's bidding again, and she wanted to marry a man of her choosing, like she was promised. And with the siblings in a disagreement, King Henry sends his friend, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, to retrieve Mary in France, but he makes him promise that he will not marry his sister, because the two had actually been known to have googly eyes for each other for a number of years before this. So when Charles Brandon arrives in France, he immediately marries Mary Tudor, which technically is considered treason to the English king, putting King Henry VIII well within his right to behead Charles. And it might be because he has a soft spot for his little sister, or it might be because he was already responsible for killing his other sister's husband, but he decides that he is not going to behead Charles, and instead he's going to allow the couple to marry again in his presence, so that is legal. And though Charles does not have to pay with his life, he does need to pay for the crime that he committed. And King Henry fines his sister and her husband £24,000. And taxation over the death penalty is a move right out of his dad's playbook, in my opinion. But this fine all but bankrupted the couple, and Mary had to give up all of her dowry and all the jewelry she had received from her late husband, King Louis XII. But Mary and Charles had a very successful marriage. They produced 4 children, with 2 of them living to adulthood. They raised their children together, as well as Charles' 2 older daughters from his previous marriage. But despite it all, Henry and Mary actually stay pretty close while Henry is the king, and Henry goes on to name his firstborn daughter Mary, after his sister. But the siblings would come to a head again when Henry would try to divorce Catherine of Aragon. Henry wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, who was one of the maids of honor who had accompanied Mary to France when she went to go marry King Louis XII. And honestly, Mary just hated Anne's fucking guts. It's really what it came down to. So she was not on board at all with this plan. She thought her brother was out of his fucking mind for this. But of course, neither she nor God herself could change Henry's mind on this. But like any sibling relationship, it is complicated, and when she passes away of the sweating sickness at age 37, Henry goes on to throw her a grand funeral, and had her buried near her beloved home where she raised her family and spent the happiest years of her life. But the rivalry doesn't really end in death for these two, because then their children pick up the torch. And 20 years later, when King Henry VIII's own son, King Edward VI, dies at 15, he left the English throne to Mary's granddaughter, Jane Grey, skipping over his Catholic sister, Mary Tudor, who was the rightful heir to the throne. But Princess Mary Tudor, or Bloody Mary as she's affectionately remembered, assembled a Catholic army and seized England back from her teenage cousin. Bloody Mary took the throne, she ruled over the English kingdom, and she had her cousin Jane Grey beheaded in the Tower of London. Because though Queen Mary may have had the same name as her beloved auntie, she was not there to fuck around with her cousins. And the rest is history.